Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special live recording of my podcast, The Brendan O'Neill Show, with me, Brendan O'Neill. Before we kick off with tonight's brilliant guest, I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending this evening. If you're attending, that means you're a Spiked supporter, and we really couldn't do what we do without Spiked supporters. We rely on the generosity of our readers to keep doing all the brilliant stuff that we do. So thank you so much for that. And obviously spread the word, tell everyone else to become a Spike supporter too. Now on to our guest. She really doesn't need an introduction. You are all familiar with Melanie Phillips. Melanie is a seasoned broadcaster, a prolific writer. You will have read her stuff in The Times, on her Substack, melaniephillipssubstack.com, and in numerous other places as well. She is, in my view, one of the great voices of reason of our time, and I'm really thrilled to have her here for the live discussion tonight. Melanie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Always a pleasure to be with you.
So, Melanie, there is a lot I want to talk to you about in a pretty short period of time this evening, but I want to kick off by asking you what life is like in Israel right now. You spend most of your time, I think, or certainly a significant chunk of your time in Israel at the moment. What's it like there? It's been 8 months now since the Hamas pogrom against the people of southern Israel, and we've seen the fallout not only between Israel and Gaza, but also in the West with the growth of increasing new forms of insanity. And I want to talk to you about some of those this evening as well. But firstly, what's life like in Israel? Is it relatively calm? Are people pulling together? Is it odd? What is it like there?
Well, you're right. I spend most of my time there, although I'm currently in London. I come to Britain a very great deal. What's life there like now? It's quite hard to describe the intensity of the experience of living there. On the one hand, this has been nearly 9 months, and the shock and the trauma have not worn off. And that's been exacerbated by the grief, which is increasing because there are young men and women on the front line, and this is a conscript army, and they are, I'm afraid the deaths among them are ratcheting up. People's children, their grandchildren, their sons-in-law are being killed or coming back from the front with no legs, terrible injuries. People are going to funeral after funeral, and the hostages are still there. And we all know that they are likely to have gone through and still be going through quite unimaginable conditions of deprivation, of starvation, of abuse, of torture, of rape. We've heard that from the hostages that have been able to return to their homes. And we don't know how many are still alive. We suspect that not many are, but we just don't know. And all this is very, very hard to take. Israel, ever since, I think people think that the nearest equivalent to this was the 1948 War of Independence, which went on for quite a long time. Its wars subsequently, always wars of defense, have been relatively short. This is a very long one. And not only that, but we all are living in expectation and fear of what's coming down the pike very soon. Because if Gaza is bad enough, then what may be unleashed if Israel feels the need to go to war properly in Lebanon is unthinkable and unconscionable. People in Britain don't realize, but ever since the war in Gaza started, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which have about 150,000 missiles pointing at Israel, most of which missiles and rockets, many of which are precision missiles and rockets, and are able to target the whole of Israel. They are infinitely more powerful than anything, and more numerous than anything the Hamas have. So if Hezbollah really unleash, then it's estimated that in the first couple of days, thousands of Israelis will die. Now, people in Britain don't realize that threat, and they don't realize that ever since the October 7 pogrom, there have been dozens and dozens of Hezbollah rockets and missile attacks on northern Israel every day. In the last few days, in the last couple of weeks, much of northern Israel has been set on fire. It is literally burning to the ground, and tens of thousands of Israelis have been unable to live in their homes on the border with Lebanon for best part of 9 months. And yet the worst may be still to come. So all that is pretty awful, and people are, as you would expect, frightened, worried, um, grief-struck, horror-struck, traumatized. And at the same time, this is the really strange thing, there is such a tremendous feeling of unity. I don't mean in the political sense. I mean, they're fighting like ferrets in the sack, as they always do in Israel's fantastically dysfunctional political culture. But in terms of the kind of population in general, everyone is pulling together. There's this tremendous volunteer effort going on the whole time, because everybody feels that they are one kind of big family. It's a very small country. Most people know people who are caught up in this in one way or another. Either they've had relatives murdered or taken hostage, or they have children or family members on the front line. But there's this tremendous sense of everyone knowing exactly who they're fighting, why they're fighting, what they're fighting for. And this sense of the Jewish people coming together. And that's an amazing thing. And also the sense that, and I think this sets it apart from other wars that Israel has been involved in, all of which, as I say, have been defensive wars against an Arab enemy, which has always been trying to exterminate Israel. So much is common ground in all those wars. But this one is different, because this one was precipitated by, you call it a pogrom, that's absolutely correct. And what that tapped into in its barbarism, in its sadism, in the joy and ecstatic delight taken by those Palestinian Arab attackers in not just murdering, but dismembering and raping and beheading and committing appalling atrocities on the Israelis simply because they were Jews, although in fact some of them weren't, but that was the assumption. That immediately reawakens the kind of cultural memory with which we're all imbued, which takes us back centuries. This is how the Jews have been attacked over the centuries, not just by people who didn't just want to get rid of the Jews, but took out on the Jews a level of sadism and barbarism and savagery, which bespoke something else. And, the young men and women on the front line, they say it. They say we are fighting with the shadows and the ghosts of our ancestors behind us. So there's this fantastic sense that this is another seismic point in Jewish history. And that's brought people together in the most amazing way. So it's a very strange cultural situation. All I can say is it's a level of intensity that is quite exhausting.
That's a really useful overview of what's going on. And you're absolutely right to describe the pogrom in the way that you do. And it always struck me that it was almost as if on the 7th of October, the kind of atavistic hatreds of history leapt off the pages of the history books and visited themselves onto the people of southern Israel. It really was the kind of thing we've only really seen in blurry black and white pictures from the last century. And suddenly it was happening in real time. It was predatory, it was sadistic, it was shared, it was joyfully shared by the people who carried the pogrom out. So there was something so deeply disturbing about it. And I think you're right to say that that distinguishes it from the other wars that Israel has fought because of the cultural memory that you described there. In relation to that, what are the Israeli people's views of the West right now? Because even as I was asking you what is life like in Israel, are people pulling together, it suddenly struck me that that's not really the kind of question you're supposed to ask people. In the West, you're not supposed to care very much about Israel. You're not supposed to give a damn about Israel, in fact. You're supposed to look upon Israel as this mad little genocidal country where people probably got what they deserved on the 7th of October. And we've seen people in the West, in supposedly progressive circles, actually saying that. So it's good to hear that people in Israel are putting together, but do they feel like they're pulling together not only against Hamas, but almost against the world? Like, is Israel against the world in this fight against the Islamist armies that have got Israel in a kind of pincer movement in the north and in the south?
They very much feel that. I mean, the Israelis cannot believe the level of perverse irrationality that has gripped so much of the West, in which the Israelis, who are facing a real threat of genocide, i.e., an enemy which says we want to wipe you all out as Jews and destroy your country, that is genocide. And yet the defense against that, which no country on earth could be expected not to defend itself against that, uniquely in the case of the Jewish people are not allowed to do that. And indeed, when they do that, it's represented as aggression, war crimes, and genocide. And, you know, the word genocide, I mean, this is another long conversation, but in the Palestinian lexicon, which they deploy in order to fight Israel existentially, they use what has been the experience of the Jews against the Jews, and they appropriate it for themselves. So they claim falsely, for example, I mean, they've claimed the Israelis have been committing genocide for decades, and clearly it is absurd because the population of Gaza and the population of the disputed territories have quintupled since 1948 when the State of Israel was created. And Israel's wars have, always been defensive. This one is supremely defensive, not just when I say supremely, what I mean is it's as people in Britain might think it's a war in retaliation for October 7. On the contrary, it's a war to get the hostages back, but also to destroy the Hamas, because the Hamas say we will continue to perpetrate October 7 type atrocities over and over again until we destroy all of you. So clearly Israel has to defend itself against that, but it's not allowed to. And it's the only country in the world which is subjected to these kind of conditions by the West. So the Israelis can't understand it. They can't understand how people can be so perverse and so irrational. And then they observe other things. They observe that the entire human rights establishment, I put human rights in inverted commas because in my view it's not human rights at all, but you know what I mean. The human rights establishment consisting of international lawyers, the United Nations, the spin-off bodies of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which contains human rights abusers in it, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and all the big NGOs like Amnesty and Oxfam and Save the Children and UNICEF. The Israelis can see that they all use so-called human rights to uniquely maintain that Israel uniquely does not have human rights. It does not have the right to defend itself. And uniquely, they tell lies about Israel, which are guaranteed and indeed intended to stir up and incite murderous hatred against Israel and against Israelis and against Jews. So the Israelis look at all this and they do feel the world is against them. And then you have America.
Yeah.
And America is a complicated story because it kind of fries your brain to look at what America is doing. Because on the one hand, it leapt into action on October 7. It sent 2 aircraft carriers to the region. It famously, Biden flew to Israel, literally put his arm around Netanyahu and said, don't. Everyone said, he said don't to Iran and to the Arab world, but actually he said don't to Israel. What actually he was saying was, since we have your back, Israel, you are not to do what we don't want you to do. And what we don't want you to do is anything that really threatens Iran. Now, this is a whole other conversation, quite why America sees Iran as an essential part of the Middle Eastern architecture going forward. And why also America's, the Biden administration, while it will not allow, we think, Israel to be actually destroyed, it will come to Israel's defense, but it does not support what Israel needs to do to defend itself, which is to destroy Hamas as a military force. It wants to preserve Hamas as an integral part of a future administration in Gaza. So you have a situation in which Israel's essential ally, America, is playing this double game in which it's basically, while kind of ensuring, we hope, that Israel isn't actually wiped out, is basically hanging it out to dry for the indefinite future in the light of Iranian attacks, Hezbollah attacks. It's telling it not to attack Hezbollah. I mean, northern Israel is burning to the ground. And it's trying to preserve Hamas. It's done everything possible to slow down and prevent Israel from destroying Hamas in Gaza. As a result, America has helped sacrifice some of those hostages, some of whom are American, some of whom are also British. So, I mean, Israel looks at the world. It says to itself, this is beyond perverse. And it says to itself, what is the explanation for this? And it comes to the conclusion it must be anti-Semitism, because no other country, people, or cause on the globe is treated like this. And then it says to itself, well, why are we surprised? Because the whole point about anti-Semitism, it's not just a prejudice. It has particular characteristics. And one of those characteristics is that it appears that the entire society, the entire world, is against the Jews, because no one comes to their defense, ever. Only the Jews fight for the Jews. And this has been, the situation of Jews since time immemorial. So why are we surprised that the Jewish state is being treated in exactly the same way? That's the way people think when they think about the West. But they don't think about the West very much, because everyone's preoccupied by, have I got enough water in my house to service not just my drinking needs, but flush the lavatories and wash for 3 days minimum if the Hezbollah really unleash. And not just the Hezbollah. If Iran thinks that the Hezbollah, its principal proxy army, if Iran thinks the Hezbollah really is threatened by Israel, then it is feared Iran itself will unleash its own missiles, and its proxy armies in Iraq, Yemen, and possibly even its proxy army, as it were, in the disputed territories in the Israeli heartland, among the Israeli heartlands, will also open up simultaneously. Now, there's no way Israel can survive that unless America comes in to help. So will America come in to help? We don't know. We were sure, foolishly, until quite recently. Now we don't know. And meanwhile, the world is saying, well, it's all Israel's fault. I mean, there isn't a single country or, as I say, people or cause in the world who, having been subjected to a fraction of what Israel has been subjected to and is being subjected to, would come to that conclusion and say those things.
I'm pleased to hear that most Israelis are not thinking too much about the West, because if they were to look too closely at some of the things that have been said in the West, they would be absolutely horrified. I'm sure they're generally aware of the Israelophobic sentiment that is quite widespread in intellectual, so-called intellectual circles. I want to ask you a bit more about this so-called human rights industry, as you refer to it in quote marks, of course. And about the issue of moral inversion. So you mentioned the International Criminal Court and its launching of an investigation into whether Israel is potentially committing a genocide in Gaza, which is a complete nonsense. But we've also seen that on the streets, of course, in London, in New York, in Sydney, across the West. We've seen people accusing Israel of genocide, mashing together the Star of David with a swastika and saying that Israelis are the new Nazis, all that kind of. I think Howard Jacobson once referred to it as abusing Jews with their own grief. And we've seen so much of that since 7th of October. And I did want to ask you, you mentioned there about people in Israel not particularly being surprised by some of the stuff that's going on in the West. And you, Melanie, I'm sure, are not surprised at all. You've been writing about the moral decay of the West for a long time. But when you see this kind of moral inversion where the people who were attacked by genocidal terrorists are accused of genocide, the people who were attacked by what I would describe as a fascistic organization are themselves accused of being fascists. You know, the people who were subjected to an act of mass murder, the like of which we haven't seen for decades, are then accused of committing mass murder when they respond to that attack and go after the people who carried it out. The levels of moral inversion have been, even by the standards of Western discussions of Israel, they've been off the scale. You won't necessarily be surprised, but you must be quite shocked sometimes when you see what's going on in Western discussions, and especially in relation to the moral inversion of the truth of what's happening there.
I'm not surprised. I am shocked. The scale of it, the extent of it, the persistence of it, and the complete impermeability to reason, rationality, are shocking and terrifying. Because, you know, the West is supposed to be ultimately rational, and it's descended into complete irrationality. There are many reasons for this. And I do see it as, in great part, as you, I think, have implied, a spin-off of what's been happening to the West more generally, apart from the issue of Israel and the Palestinians and all that. In this sense, first of all, you know, and I'm sure we've had this discussion, and I've written about it and you've written about it for a long time. But, you know, the West is a post-truth culture now. You know, we collectively in the West abolished truth. When was it? In the 70s, 60s, whatever it was, you know, starting in the universities. You know, only the most unsophisticated and uneducated believe in an objective truth. Everything is a matter of subjective opinion. My truth is as good as your truth. I make up my way of life, and it's no better or worse than your way of life. You have no reason to think to tell me, no right to tell me that my way of life in the West is any better than your way of life in the developing world. You know, the human rights are no better in the West than anywhere else. In fact, the human rights in the West are terrible because human West was born in sin. And that whole argument, which basically got rid of truth and enabled people, or opened up the way for truth to be replaced by lies, because nobody had any means of distinguishing between the two. Along with that went what I would call, what others have called, consequentialism. And consequentialism follows from the complete collapse of a moral sense. A moral sense depends on discrimination, become a boo word. But, you know, unless you have a hierarchy of values, unless you discriminate between values that are better than others that are worse, unless you discriminate between good and bad, truth and lies, victim, victimizer, all those sorts of things, you have no moral sense at all. And if you have no moral sense, then all that matters is the consequences of an action. The motivation for an action doesn't matter, because the motivation is irrelevant, because it doesn't matter whether you were right or wrong. It's not only irrelevant, it's just not a question you should even ask. It doesn't matter who started the war. It doesn't matter if Israel was put upon rather than putting upon others. The fact is, in the beginning, the fact is the consequences matter. The consequences are, you look at Gaza, the Hamas are saying 37,000 civilians have died. Okay, we can have a discussion about whether that figure is correct, but that's not the point. Let's assume for a moment that is the ballpark figure. So 37,000 civilians have died. Therefore, because it's a lot of people who've died, therefore the people who pulled the trigger, who dropped the bombs, who fired the missiles, the Israelis, are responsible. And therefore, they have committed genocide, because genocide just means killing a lot of people. And it doesn't matter whether you kill people in defense, which is in fact the definition of a just war. You fight against a tyrant, you fight against oppression, you fight against genocide, and you kill people in a just war, which has to be proportionate to the threat. That goes out the window. All that matters is the consequences. And we see that the whole time in our daily lives. You know, you don't hold people to account for what they do if they belong to an approved group. in society, if they suffer from a disadvantage, if they commit a crime, it's never their responsibility. It's never the fault of the fickle finger of fate. It's the fault of the oppressor class. And so, you know, the moral inversion of victim and victimizer between the Palestinian Arabs and Israel is part of that perverse cultural, I would say, deformation. And then the last thing I would say, this is, you know, it's not the last thing, not the last reason, but by any means, because there are other reasons. But the last thing I would say was really, really important in all this is that I think it's impossible to exaggerate the corrupting and corrosive effect on Western culture of the adoption of the Palestinian cause by educated, well-meaning, left-leaning, liberal, progressive people. There is no platform in the West to give the opposition to that cause. So people really don't know there is another case. People who are well-meaning think that by supporting the Palestinian cause, they are supporting the cause of an oppressed people. And they think that they are, it's an entirely respectable cause because they think that these Palestinian people, you know, they were deprived of their country, their state, their land, and they're still being oppressed. And it doesn't mean that you have any bad feelings towards the state of Israel's existence. It doesn't mean you have bad feelings about Jews. No. You just want rights for the Palestinians. And that's what the Palestinian cause is about. That's what people tell themselves. And it's completely and utterly fantasy, because the Palestinian cause, not that anybody in Britain realizes this, because nobody ever tells them, the Palestinian cause is based entirely upon A, the destruction of Israel as a Jewish homeland, and B, a theological Islamic hatred of the Jewish people. And you only have to look at the Memory website, the Palestinian Media Watch website, to see the videos of what the Palestinian Authority, forget the Hamas, this is the Palestinian Authority, who are supposedly the statesmen in waiting for a Palestinian state that all progressive people think should be established. They're the people who would run it, okay? And you see what they are producing every day, every week, every month, that they are teaching their children. And they teach their children not just that Israel must be destroyed in its entirety, not just that the children's highest goal is to grow up to, in my words, steal Israeli cities for themselves, but their highest goal is to kill Jews as Jews. And it's presented in an Islamic theological way, that Jews are demonic, devilish. They're responsible for all the ills of the entire world. I mean, it is pure anti-Semitism and couched in imagery which is straight out of the Nazi playbook. Indeed, Mahmoud Abbas, his role model, as he himself has always said, his highest role model is a man who was the chief mufti of Jerusalem in the 1930s Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was Hitler's ally and who entered into a pact with Hitler that when Hitler won the war, Haj Amin would eradicate every Jew in the Middle East, not just in Palestine as was, in the Middle East. Now, that is Mahmoud Abbas's role model. Mahmoud Abbas is the statesman in waiting. Mahmoud Abbas is the person who all liberal progressives believe is entitled to run a state by a Palestinian Authority, which has taught its children over generations to hate and murder Jews. Now, that's not just a cause that is in a foreign country. That cause is espoused vigorously by every progressive in the West. And so while they may well tell themselves there is nothing disreputable about that cause, on the contrary, it's only about the human rights of the Palestinians, they are actually articulating a doctrine of extermination of Jews. And so if you realize that, and they are articulating a doctrine which casts itself as the heirs to the Nazi Party. And if you realize that, then you look at these intellectuals, so-called, in the West, accusing Israel of genocide, and you realize that they are simply spouting the language used by a cause that they support, which is bent on the extermination of the Jewish people. And they really don't realize that. But it's not a surprise to me, therefore, that this language is being used and that these terrible instincts have been released. There's more to it than that, but I think these are, quite significant factors.
In relation to that, I wanted to ask you about anti-Zionism, because I find it just a fascinating phrase apart from anything else. You mentioned there about how progressives in the West have adopted the Palestinian cause, and they've been doing that for some time. And as you say, most of them don't really know very much about Israel or the Palestinian territories or what the politics of the region is. There is this kind of knee-jerk assumption that if you're a good, decent person in polite society, you've got to wear a Palestine badge and you've got to hate Israel. That's become this very kind of presumptive kind of virtue signaling politics that exists. But since 7th of October, we have seen a growth not only in the kind of pro-Palestine posturing, which is how these people define their politics, but also a growth in real virulent anti-Zionism. And I am now completely of the opinion that the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism just doesn't exist anymore. And when we see people getting on the subway in New York and saying, "Are there any Zionists here? This is your chance to get off the train." Or when we see people holding up placards saying Zionism is a cancer in the world. Or when we see people at universities in the UK and in America saying death to Zionists, death to Zionism, I just think to myself, we know who you're talking about. You might try and present this as a critique of a political idea, that is the idea of a national homeland for the Jews, but we know that you're talking about Jews. So isn't the growth of the kind of anti-Zionism as a political personality in the West really symptomatic of a growth of the anti-Semitic ideology more broadly?
Well, yes. I mean, anti-Zionism is a polite fiction to conceal the fact that people want to hate Jews. And they knew it was wrong to hate Jews. And they were very pleased to find a way in which they could do so without being seen to do so. And, in theory, the two are distinct. If you take Zionism to be the political movement which started with Theodor Herzl, around the turn of the end of the 19th to beginning of the 20th century, you can just about make a plausible case for saying, well, that was a political movement and that wasn't necessarily to do with Jews, except that even then it wasn't. That wasn't the case. It was bound up with the Jewish people in their ancient homeland. But more to the point, Zionism is simply, what is Zionism? Zionism is simply the self-determination of Jewish people in their ancient homeland. There is no people on the earth who are told that they're not entitled to want their own self-determination in their own homeland. Now, people say, well, there are plenty of people who claim, the Catalans claim independence, and we don't give independence to everybody who comes along and says they want independence. And that is true. But the Jews are the only people for whom the current state of Israel was ever their national kingdom. And it was so for several centuries before it was conquered by serried waves of invaders, and several centuries before Islam was even invented. And the Jews have never lost their connection with that land. And there was always a presence in the land of Israel. There was always a Jewish presence in the town of Sfat in northern Israel. And from the mid-19th century, there was a Jewish majority in Jerusalem. So that's that fact. And then the second fact is that self-determination in the land of Israel for the Jewish people is an essential component of Judaism itself. Now, let me explain a bit more, because that may be misleading to some people. That doesn't mean that all Jews are Zionists. It doesn't mean that all Jews want to live in Israel. It doesn't mean that all Jews support Israel. It doesn't mean that all Jews are religious Jews. You don't have to be religious to be a Jew. However, Judaism is uniquely composed of three components: the people, the religion, and the land. And the three are inseparable. Judaism is about the people in the land practicing a particular set of beliefs. And they have to be practiced in the land. Or they came out of the belief in the land. Without the land, Judaism falls apart. Doesn't mean that all Jews live in the land or want to live in the land. That's not the point. Judaism itself, if you separate out those three components, it's not Judaism anymore. So if you take it from that point of view, anti-Zionism actually anti-Judaism, not anti-Semitic, it's anti-Judaism. It's a dagger at the heart of Judaism itself. Now, people then say, but a lot of Jews are anti-Zionists. And killer point, they think, there were a number of Jews who were opposed to Zionism when Herzl started doing his thing around the turn of the 20th century. And that is absolutely correct. But there is a tremendous difference between then and now. Then was before the Holocaust. It was before the State of Israel existed, and it was before people even began to understand that the Arab and Muslim world was determined to remove all Jews from their homeland. And so when Jewish and other thinkers were anti-Zionist in the early decades of the 20th century, it was a completely different context. And to be anti-Zionist then was to be anti a kind of ideal, which in the context of the times, the ideal may have seemed unattainable, it may have seemed undesirable, but the context of now is that it would entail the destruction of the State of Israel. Uniquely among countries of the world, it would be destroyed, and as a homeland for its indigenous people. And it would be undertaken in the full knowledge that there is, the Holocaust showed that a Jewish homeland was essential for the continuation of the Jewish people, because uniquely other countries would not take them in. And they were uniquely oppressed by the world. So in a kind of way, the world had an obligation to say, for goodness sake, give them their own homeland. So all those things mean that Zionism is unique. It's unique, and it's unique in the context of Judaism, in the sense that if you attack Zionism, you attack Judaism. It's unique in the context of the ability of the Jewish people to survive in their own homeland. And the final point is that, when I was growing up, I don't remember anti-Zionism being a thing. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, when I was growing up, 50s and early 60s, Israel was very much favored. It was a kind of socialist paradise. To the west, it was filled with, young bronzed Israelis who were dressed in shorts and all having free love and picking oranges. What's not to like, people thought. And then it became something different, and that was all to do with the rise of what's called the non-aligned nations in the United Nations. In the United Nations, the rise of liberation theology and liberation this and liberation that, and the rise of a kind of Marxist view of the world. I'm sorry if I impinge upon past theologies as far as you're concerned, but a kind of rise of a Marxist view of the world, which caught up a number of developing world nations in hatred of Israel for all kinds of post-colonial, that sort of rubbish reasons. I mean, I say rubbish because Israel is deemed to be colonialist, but actually Israel has always had to fight and is currently fighting against colonialism. It's the Arabs who are colonizers, and always were and still are would-be colonizers. Anyway, the rise of all that in the developing world brought anti-Zionism to the fore in the United Nations. United Nations passed this terrible resolution, Zionism is racism. That was later rescinded, but nevertheless, that poisonous thinking remained. That didn't go away just because that particular UN resolution was overturned.
It's so extraordinary to hear you saying, reminding people that attitudes to Israel were quite different in the 60s and the early 70s. And people, young people today wouldn't believe you if you told them that progressives and hippies and leftish types, not necessarily Marxists as you described there, but certainly leftish types in the West tended to take Israel's side in the Israel-Arab wars of the late 60s and the early 70s. There's that famous, wonderful photo of Leonard Cohen playing the guitar for IDF soldiers during the Yom Kippur War. And there was a view that Israel represented something positive and progressive, and the phoenix rising from the flames of the Holocaust, and bringing beauty to the Middle East and creating this new ambitious country. That was held by lots of people on the cultural left, whereas now there's been a complete turnaround. I wanted to get your views. So I think you've described anti-Zionism there very, very well. I wanted to get your views on anti-Semitism. What we know is anti-Semitism. I do think anti-Zionism is so similar it's almost indistinguishable. But we have seen actual spikes in anti-Semitism in the West since 7th of October. The thing that struck me about the pogrom of 7th of October is that people were on the streets protesting in London, in Sydney, in New York on the 8th of October. This was before Israel had even decided what to do, before it had properly responded to the attack on its citizens. And what you realize, you watch that and you realize these are not protests against Israel. These are celebrations of a pogrom. And it was as offensive as if people had taken to the streets to celebrate Kristallnacht. I mean, it was that shocking and disturbing. But we have seen more and more examples of anti-Semitism. There's been a huge rise. Just this week, I've been reading about Jewish kids being roughed up at Belsize Park, Jewish school kids. Near where I lived, there's the Jewish Free School, and early on after the 7th of October, the kids there were told that they could take off their school blazers in case anyone recognized them as Jews, and that might get them into trouble. And of course, there's been violence, there's been attacks on synagogues. The thing that struck me about all of this is the silence of the so-called anti-racists. You know, the people who said silence is violence during the BLM riots of 2020 are now, if silence is still violence, they have been incredibly violent to the Jewish people because they've said nothing whatsoever. They haven't protested. They haven't raised any concerns about this huge rise in anti-Semitic behavior. To what extent do you think this kind of so-called anti-racism, which is really identity politics, actually feeds into anti-Semitism? So you have this ironic situation now where anti-racism actually inflames anti-Semitism because it presents the Jews as these kind of privileged white people who don't deserve any sympathy and probably do deserve a roughing up because they've got so much privilege in life. So there's an interplay between those things, isn't there, in the West?
The intersectionality doctrine with, overlapping victim groups absolutely plays into this. It divides the world into powerful and powerless, which is idiotic, but is Marxist, basically. And Marx was the most profound anti-Semite who believed that the ideal society would be one without any Jews in it, and he was born a Jew. So intersectionality, divides people up into powerful and powerless, and decides that the Jews are always powerful. Why does it decide the Jews are powerful? Because it decides it believes that the Jews are behind capitalism, which is what Marx said, and that the Jews run the world in their own interests, and to the disadvantage of everybody else. And that is profound anti-Semitism. So at the root of intersectionality is anti-Semitism. It's not simply, it's sort of overlapping characteristics. It is based on it. And it's then inflamed further by its espousal of the Palestinian agenda, which very much, feeds into that. But that's the intersectional bit. That's the intersectional zealots. And a lot of people who are anti-Semitic are not intersectional zealots at all.
Yeah.
I mean, when I started getting really worried about all this, it was long before intersectionality. It was before even there was a large influx of Muslims into the country. And Muslims are disproportionately anti-Jew, unfortunately. And again, that's something that people don't ever talk about. And that has greatly complicated the issue. And I believe that is one of the main motives behind all these as you say, ecstatic demonstrations that we're seeing, exulting in the murder of Jews. But this thing that we're talking about, this eruption of anti-Semitism, predates that. I mean, this is, I don't want to go into detail, it's a long story, but I first became aware of it in 1982 on the left, and it was against Israel and it was against Jews, but it was really against Jews, but they were pretending it was about Israel. And that's when I first heard the Israelis called Nazis in 1982. A monstrous charge by any rational definition. And then the next major eruption or spike or emergence of this, of any note, was, in my view, with the Intifada, the second Intifada, which broke out in the year 2000, in which, I've forgotten the figure, upwards of 1,300, 1,500 Israelis were basically blown to smithereens over a number of years. They were blown up in pizza parlors and buses, and the young were particularly targeted. And Israel basically, went into action in the disputed territories, as they're called. People call it the West Bank, to root out the sources of these attacks. And immediately, Israel was blamed. Israel was represented as the aggressor, and out of the woodwork came unbridled anti-Semitism directed against Jews as Jews. Anyone who was Jewish was immediately accused of being clannish or sticking together. You all think the same thing. You all defend the indefensible, unless you actually denounced Israel. And if you supported Israel, you were accused, as I was on Question Time, I think it was in 2001, I can't remember quite the date, maybe in 2002, of dual loyalty. And at that time, I think I'd been to Israel twice to see our daughter who was there for a year. And, where did all that come from? And I thought about that a lot. And it became so complicated because it was all couched as anti-Israel. And it was, it was denied that it was anti-Jew, but it was clearly anti-Jew because Jews were being targeted as Jews. And it seemed to me, and I still think this, that one of the contributory factors, and this sounds terrible, but I do believe it to be profoundly true, that, and somebody actually said this to me. He was a liberal journalist, and he said, you've got this anti-Semitism thing completely wrong. We're not seeing anti-Semitism. And I said, oh, well, what are we seeing then? And he said, what you have to realize is that it's such a relief that we don't have to worry about the Jews anymore. Mildly, it was an ambiguous comment. I didn't understand what he meant. I said, what do you mean you don't have to worry? In what sense were you ever worried? And he said, well, you've got to understand that after the concentration camps, anti-Semitism was completely forbidden. And so we couldn't say what we thought about Jews until now. And now we can. Such a relief. I say, what? What? You're telling me that because Israel is defending itself against mass terrorist murder, you've got the Jew as Nazi, and therefore, with one bound, you're free? Mm. And he said, well, that's not what I said. And I said, that's exactly what you've said. And I do think there is something in this, that the West really can't cope with the fact that it was complicit in the greatest crime against humanity, although, Germany was the center of it. And of course, Britain and the Allies went to war against Germany. But nevertheless, the Holocaust happened because people turned their faces away from it when there were warnings about it going on, about it building, and tremendous anti-Semitism in Britain at the time, and during the war. It was only when the camps were discovered, when Auschwitz was discovered, the whole thing went underground. And, you know, making the Jew into a Nazi, making the Israeli into a Nazi, you know, with one bound, the West is free. Because if the Jews are Nazis, well, then the Nazis were just like, well, we might all become Nazis. And so there was nothing particularly terrible about the Nazis. And so there was nothing particularly terrible about our failure to deal with it at the time. So with one bound, they're free. And, you know, and it goes even further back than this. You know, there's this, I have this feeling, and I'm not alone in feeling this among the Jewish community, certainly in Israel. There is a feeling that, you know, for the Western world, they've had it up to here with the Jewish people. They don't want to hear about the Jews ever again. There's so much trouble. They want the Jews out of their heads, out of their consciences, out of their world altogether. They want them gone. They don't want to hear anything more. And they certainly don't want to hear about the Jew as victim. And that's why also you have this tremendous pushback. That's why you have the ignoring, as you said, of anti-Semitism. That's why you have the ignoring of the rapes of Israeli women. That's why you have this attempt to turn the great crime of October 7 into the great crime by Israel, because nothing can be allowed to disturb the narrative. The narrative has to be kept on track that the Jews are responsible for bad things. They're not the victims of bad things. Because if the Jews are victims of bad things, then we have to rethink our entire attitude towards the Palestinians, and we have to rethink our entire attitude towards everything, because the Jews are our scapegoats. And if we don't have that, then we fall back on our own responsibility for our own misdeeds. That cannot happen. It cannot happen. And so whatever happens, however bad things are, you know, you wait. Heaven forbid Hezbollah should unleash. Heaven forbid the Iranians should unleash. But you watch. You watch. The British media, which has not mentioned the Hezbollah attacks at all, except to say skirmishes, tit for tat. There is back and forth. No, it's not back and forth. It's an onslaught by the Hezbollah, which is in which northern Israel has been burned to the ground, and tens of thousands have been evacuated from their homes, I mean refugees inside Israel for months. That is ignored, because the only thing that the West can deal with is the Jew as aggressor. So if Israel now really unleashes against Lebanon to stop this, then it's going to be, well, Israel has done this, Israel's fault, Israel is killing all these people. And again, the whole thing will be inverted again. You and I both know how this thing is going to play out. It's how it's always played out. And in my view, this is why it's a terrible thing to say. The West needs the Jews to be aggressors, never victims, in order that the West can avoid its own moral culpability and this terrible business of the Jews being the West's conscience, which it cannot abide.
That's so well put. And I think it's one of the reasons why it might not seem like the biggest issue going on right now, considering that there are wars taking place. But that's one of the reasons why the Holocaust inversion that is taking place in Western discussion right now is so incredibly important to challenge, because we are witnessing a process where the sins of the West are being projected onto the Jews. The sins of the world are being thrown onto the Jews, and the Jews are being scapegoated for those sins. And it is such an extraordinary level of inversion. And when you invert the Holocaust and the meaning of the Holocaust, you obviously demean the memory of it entirely. And it's such a dangerous intellectual trend. It really is. Melanie, I could ask you a million more questions, but I've got to throw some questions at you from the audience. So we'll do a few quick fire questions from people who are watching and listening. Here's a good one. Do you think 7th of October has exposed just how lost, unbalanced and untrustworthy the BBC and the Western mainstream media have become? Is there a practical solution to this problem?
Yeah, defund the BBC. Look, the media in general, as I've just said, does not give any platforms for an alternative view to the one that Israel is the aggressor in the region. Yeah. And it has been responsible for amplifying and promulgating the lies of Hamas day in, day out. However, the BBC is in a different category because the BBC is uniquely in the world, has a unique reputation for trustworthiness and objectivity. And, with good cause in the past, people in oppressive regimes relied on the BBC to tell the truth, and they hung on to it. And now, in my view, and I really don't think this is an exaggeration, because of its global reach, its unique authoritativeness, its unique influence in the world, that it's uniquely trusted in a way that newspapers are never trusted and other broadcasting outlets aren't trusted. Because of those unique, worthy characteristics, the BBC is uniquely responsible in enormous measure for inciting hatred and mass murder of Jews and Israelis, and amplifying the agenda of those bent on the extermination of Israel and the Jews. And the level of perfidy of the BBC is very, very hard to credit unless you've really been immersed in it, in which case, I know a couple of researchers who are immersed in it, and they feel filthy because they're in a sewer. You wouldn't believe the extent of it, the depth of it, the breadth of it, the wickedness of it. You just have to read one or two of these websites to really get a grasp of the lies that are told. And, all these good people in Britain, they have no idea that they've been lied to in this way, because the BBC, it helps make the cultural weather. It's a very important part of the cultural weather. If the BBC says something, everybody else falls into line, just like when the New York Times says something, the BBC falls into line. It's an echo chamber, to coin a phrase. And so I do think the media generally, but the BBC in particular, have a very, very heavy responsibility in all of this.
Right, a question from Gareth. The media and political classes often try to make an equivalence between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Is this a false equivalence?
Yeah. Yes, I think it is a false equivalence. Now, the Jewish community leadership in Britain does not agree with me, and it thinks I'm Islamophobic and says so for saying what I'm about to say. In my view, it's a wicked thing to equate Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Islamophobia was created by the Islamists, the political Islam wing of the Islamic world, the bit of the Islamic world that wants to basically take over the West. It was invented to fry the West's brain by making an equivalence with other kinds of phobia, by casting a prejudice as a mental illness, and by tapping into this equation with anti-Semitism. The Jews have anti-Semitism, which is unique. No, it's not unique because we have the same thing. It's another cultural appropriation. Now, why is it different? Because Islam, all prejudice is bad, but it has to be prejudice. It has to be, you can't be prejudiced if you're telling the truth. A prejudice rests on lies and defamation and bigotry, which means that you have a view which is not supported by evidence. It's produced by some sort of innate feelings of some kind. Now, there are people who have such a view about minority faiths of one kind or another, or minority cultures, and Muslims and Islam is no different. There are people who hate Muslims because they hate Jews, because they hate Black people. It's part of that, no question. However, Islamophobia was not invented for that reason. That would just be anti-Muslim prejudice. Islamophobia was invented to pathologize and uniquely stigmatize any criticism of the Islamic world whatsoever and make it beyond the pale. So you cannot criticize anything about Islam. You cannot criticize anything about the Muslim community without being accused of Islamophobia. And you cannot say, as I have said and will say again, that there is a greatly disproportionate amount of Jew hatred in the Muslim world. You can't say that without being called Islamophobic. Now, so from that point of view, if you draw attention to the risks from political Islamism, the risks to the West, you are Islamophobic. If you point out Muslim anti-Semitism, you're Islamophobic. So you cannot point out the dangers to the free world or the civilized world from anything to do with Islam. And as a result, Islamophobia is a weapon against the West. You fry the West's brain so that you make it impossible for it to say, to give a proper, appropriate, and necessary warning about the threats that it's facing. Now, why is that different from anti-Semitism? I would suggest that anti-Semitism is in a category of its own. It's not a simple prejudice. It's not even a simple racism. The point about anti-Semitism is that it is a unique prejudice for a unique people with a unique history of persecution. And it's a unique prejudice because it has characteristics which are applied to no other people, cause, or country, and no other prejudice. So among its unique characteristics are that it's composed entirely, not just of lies, but defamatory lies. It rests on simultaneously the belief that the Jews are the most powerful people in the world and the most degraded people in the world. It rests upon a paranoid, and I really mean that in a clinical fashion, a paranoid view that the Jews, who are a fraction of the world's population, are in control of everything that's powerful in the world, and are responsible for all the ills of the world and subject the world to power and influence which they conceal. So this is paranoia. And other unique characteristics, double standards. You hold the Jews to a standard which you would expect of no other people, cause, or country, and in which you are indeed impossible to meet, and so on and so on. Now, these characteristics are not true of prejudice against Muslims, and they're not true of prejudice against anyone else in the world. They are unique to Jews. And of course, you know, the idea that the Jews are unique in any way, you know, a red mist descends among certain people when you say that. They can't bear the fact. No, of course the Jews aren't unique. I mean, you know, the idea that Jews are unique, I mean, who do they think they are? That's precisely why they're so awful, because they think they're unique, and so on and so on and so on. So no, they're not the same, and it's wicked to equate them.
Yeah, I can't remember who said it, but someone that's incredibly well put, and it reminded me that someone once said that we're fast reaching a situation where it is considered Islamophobic to talk about anti-Semitism. Okay, Melanie, we're running over. That's my fault for asking too many questions, but I've got two more audience questions I want to throw at you before you go. Verity says, "Hi Melanie, how depressed are you at the prospect of a likely Labour government? Do you think Starmer will be able to resist the anti-Semitic voices in the party?"
Oh my goodness. The only reason I'm not depressed is because I'm so caught up with what's going on in Israel, which, quite frankly, you know, I mean, if you're facing, you know, possible immolation by the massed forces of Iran, Hezbollah, and everybody else, you know, you can't really think of much else. So forgive me if I kind of diminish the horror that's impending of the Starmer ascendancy, assuming that's what's going to happen. Do I think he's going to fight off anti-Semitism in his party and bad things generally? The short answer is I don't know. The conventional wisdom is that if he has a very large majority, as is forecast, he'll be his own person, and he won't then be in hock to the various interest groups, both in his party and outside his party. Well, that's an argument. I don't necessarily buy that argument in itself, because I think even prime ministers with a very large majority, you know, they're basically democratic politicians, and they keep an eye open for, they keep a very wary eye on how public opinion is shaping up. So I don't think that he would be immune. But my real problem with Starmer is not whether he would be vulnerable to the extremists and the crazies and the anti-Semites. He himself, I think, you know, there's not a shred of anti-Semitism at all, not a shred. And, you know, he has many very decent instincts, solid instincts, and so on. However, he is not a centrist. In my view, he is a human rights lawyer. And if that sounds like I mean it to be an insult, I do. because human rights in quotation marks is what's part of what's led us to this sorry past. It's led us to intersectionality. It's led us to, you know, the idea that whatever I want to be is what I am, and so on. And so in other words, he actually believes most of this stuff, not the anti-Semitism, put that to one side. But, you know, the stuff about Israel, he sort of parks that in a different area from the anti-Semitism. And then he looks at the Israel thing and he says, genuinely, I'm sure, genuinely, he says, Israel has every right to defend itself, but not too much. Well, it's like the Biden administration. You know, you can't have it. You can't be half in, half out on this. Either it can defend itself or it can't. Either it can defend itself like any other country faced with a genocidal threat will defend itself, or it can't. You can't be both. And I think he has the same attitude towards Islam or Islamophobia. To be put, I mean, you know, I watched this. Was it the PPB he did with Sadiq Khan? In which, you know, it was very sort of staged, but Sadiq Khan was saying, you know, what are you going to do about Islamophobia? And he was saying, well, you know, Islamophobia is terrible. I'm gonna really do something. We're gonna really take it on. And, you know, I mean, under Starmer, I believe Britain is, if he does what I think he wants to do, we're going to get, or Britain's going to get a blasphemy law. Mm-hmm. And suddenly you're going to find that Islamophobia has statutory teeth, or rather prohibiting it. And suddenly you're going to find the things I kind of said this evening about the Islamic world going to be hate crime. I can see that coming. And I don't think if it came, I don't think that's because he would be, you know, in hoc to his extremists. I think it's because he subscribes to a way of thinking that leads him in that direction. And he cannot bring himself to appreciate where the line should be drawn, and certainly cannot begin to appreciate the damage that human rights culture has done. So, for example, when David Lammy says, we support the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and, you know, if the ICC issues as the prosecutor has requested, arrest warrants against Israel's prime minister and the defense minister, we will enact them. We will enact them if it came to it, because we uphold the rule of law. We uphold the International Criminal Court. Well, actually, the prosecutor in this case not only gave credence to Hamas propaganda and lies, which should elicit the response that this is unconscionable, but he also, in going for Israel in the way that he has done by his request for arrest warrants, gone against the rules of the ICC itself, which say that the ICC only has jurisdiction to interfere with another country if it is sure that that country cannot or will not carry out its own investigations. Now, Israel is in the middle of a war, so he has prejudged the war. So even by its own rules, it's ridiculous. So I'm suggesting Keir Starmer can't see that because he's a human rights lawyer. Okay, he was DPP, he was actually a human rights lawyer who went rogue for a few years. And as a human rights lawyer, human rights are the Ark of the Covenant. Human rights is a religion. It is the acme of decency and morality and all of it. In my view, it's the solvent. It's the opposite. So that's why I think he's going to go in that direction, even without pressure from within or without.
You might not be depressed, Melanie, but some of us are quite depressed by the prospect of this Labour government. So we'll see what happens with that. Okay, the last question for you. This is from Kerry. This is a big one, so you might not be able to answer it in one go, but it's something for everyone to think about. Kerry says, you have given us a very vivid picture of the horrors that are taking place in Israel. And obviously Israel has to fight, but given its isolation, is it possible that Israel will win?
Yes, it's not only possible, it is certain. And I'll tell you why it's certain, because it has no alternative. It does not have the luxury of losing. If Israel loses, it dies. And it won't do that. So am I saying that it's going to be plain sailing? Absolutely not. In Israel, everyone is entirely realistic. Everybody appreciates that as far as the North is concerned, and about which I've spoken, we could be in for horrors that make the war in Gaza pale into insignificance. And that would be dreadful. Worst case scenario, a lot of Israelis die. A lot. Thousands. It's possible. It's possible also that America won't come to our support in Israel. All things are possible. But, you know, we go back to 1948 in our collective memory. In 1948, the War of Independence, when a number of Arab armies declared war upon the newly declared state of Israel. And everybody knew Israel couldn't possibly win. A few 100,000 Jews against, millions and millions of Arabs. I mean, no contest. And Israel won. Israel won. And for a long time, it had no weapons. And Jerusalem was under siege. People starved. And it won. Now, there are various practical reasons why it won, which need not concern us. The fact is, everybody assumed that it was completely outnumbered and unarmed, relatively speaking, couldn't win. And it did. And there's very much that mood now in Israel. The prime minister, whatever you think of Netanyahu, and I won't go into that, but, he said to and of Biden, when Biden was threatening him, I will do terrible things to you if you don't do what I telling you to do in Gaza. If you don't slow down, if you don't do it, then I will cut off all your arms. And Netanyahu said that he said to Biden, if necessary, we will fight with our fingernails. They will fight to the end, the very end. Now, if people are that determined, they will win. The cost may be terrible. And what does winning look like? I can't tell you. But if you mean, will Israel continue to exist? Yes. If you mean it may have terrible costs in achieving that, quite possibly. But it will win because it has to. And because, unlike the West, it wants to. It wants to live. And this is the great weapon it has. It's a culture of life against a culture of death. And the Arabs tell us, the Muslim world tells the West, we're going to win against you, the West, because we, the Muslim world, believe in death. And you believe in life. And your belief in life makes you weak. Okay, but it doesn't. Because if you believe in life, you live. And if you believe in death, you die. It's quite simple. And that's what Israel's up against. And that is what the West is up against. Whatever's happening to Israel now is coming for the West. The West, tragically, at the moment, doesn't realize that. But eventually, it will. Whether it realizes it too late is another matter. But it will realize it eventually, because that's the trajectory. So will Israel win this? I have dark moments. How could one not have dark moments? I mean, looking at what's arrayed against Israel, I mean, how could you not have dark moments? But, the Jewish people has been through this before, and its losses have been vast, unconscionable. And yet the Jewish people are the one people who have outlived every single civilization that's tried to destroy it. So that's how I go to bed at night thinking. And for that, I'm able to stave off the nightmares for at least a few hours.
Melanie, thank you very much.
Thank you, as ever.